come up with any excuses like a snowstorm or anything. We are privileged. It's been a while since Reid has been up here to speak to the college. We had a short tour today, and he was reminiscing about the Quonset huts and some other facilities we had. For some of you, the students, that probably doesn't mean anything, because unless you've looked at the snake poster out here in the hallway, you know how far back that might go. Mr. Williamson is the president and CEO of Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana, has been with the foundation since 1979. Before that, he was with Historic Savannah Foundation in Savannah, Georgia. He has been a good friend of the college, been active with programs here at the college, and I went up to my office to find a poster I could drop. He just commented he hadn't seen that in a long time. That's a poster from 1977 when some of us, Dave Hermanson, Hari Yangi, myself, were working on some Your Town Past and Future program with the Landmarks Foundation. And that I show this just as an example of the many opportunities we've had at the college to work with the Landmarks Foundation, and obviously the future we see as being a very bright one. Many of the employees of the foundation are with our Ball State graduates, and we were discussing several of those this evening at the dinner. So the obvious connection is that Landmarks and Ball State has had a very good past, and we continue to look at the future. Reid is going to talk this evening about the state of preservation and talk about, I know, some of the buildings here in Muncie and some of the programs that they are involved with. And I'm excited and look forward to welcoming and hope that you will join me in welcoming Reid Williamson from Historic Landmarks Foundation. This is always the truth.
1, 4, 5, 6. Okay, but I 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. I work for Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana, which is a private, nonprofit, statewide citizens group. Underline citizens group. We're totally voluntary. When we have dealings with the government, it is usually to influence the government by our way of thinking for conservation, historic preservation purposes, and for redevelopment for historic preservation's sake. We think that the bedrock of historic preservation throughout this country, from the history of historic preservation to today's many accomplishments from coast to coast and border, lies with a good old American voluntary system, that of seeing a cause, seeing a need in the local level, at the local community, filling that need by organizing around a citizens volunteer group and doing something about providing a solution for the problem. There's nothing different in the solution to the problems of historic preservation, in my view, in the 30 years that I have been practicing it, in the last 25 getting paid for it. And that is using our good old volunteer ability, our tradition of this country for volunteer leadership to stop the needless demolition and destruction of our national patrimony. And in this case, I'll confine my remarks to our Hoosier patrimony, our Indiana history. Historic Landmarks is now located in a brand new restoration and building that I will discuss, particularly for you design students, in a little bit more detail in a minute. We moved our state headquarters from the waiting station of Crown Hill Cemetery. Many people thought that the location in the cemetery was just about right for antiquarians and historic preservationists. We thought a bit differently, although this location served us well. The reason we thought a bit differently is that we view historic preservation not as a retardant to progress and growth, but rather as a means of progress, a method of expansion and growth. So just 1 year ago, to this day, as a matter of fact, our state operation moved from this wonderful facility to the canal redevelopment area in downtown Indianapolis. Moved to a building that we had to pick up and move in order to save it. The 1871 Charles J. Kuhn House, now the oldest building along the canal redevelopment area. And through a technique that's been proven successful throughout this country called a revolving loan fund, whereby historic preservation organizations buy a building, sell it, and in the meantime, as the building passes through their ownership, a tax protective covenant, so the building will be protected forever and more from demolition or from unsympathetic exterior remodeling or renovation. So here the building, after it was moved across the bridge into the other side of the canal, sat waiting to be acquired by a new owner. Sat for 4 years until our organization decided that the market was not coming up fast enough to the sum $300,000 and $350,000 that we had invested in this property by way of the land acquisition and the building move itself. So our decision was then to relocate our state headquarters, to call it the Heritage Preservation Center for the state of Indiana. Notice the difference between, is my reverse the next button? I guess not. Here's reverse. Notice the difference between this faceless historic facade, you will, and what a little bit of cleanup with a Trump loyal attention to plywood over the windows to make the plywood look like windows. Look what, at least in my view, you can argue with it, at least in my view, how that building's face comes alive again. And thus, in the first instance, although it's trickery, it's fake, it's Trump loyal, and nevertheless, during the languid period of this building, by this cosmetic treatment, we think gave itself new life and new life to the neighborhood itself. Money makes most things happen in this country, and money makes historic preservation work. It's just a rudiment, it's basic, and for those that say there is no money in historic preservation, my answer is you haven't found it yet. One has to go out and raise it, one has to look for it, and you don't get it if you don't ask for it. And in this project, we needed $2 million that we didn't have to convert this building that we moved, that you saw with its non-face and then with its face put on, and to double its size. So a campaign was started to ask for voluntary contributions, and with credit to the Ball Brothers Foundation, as well institutions, organizations, individuals, and private foundations around the state contributed to make the nation's first Heritage Preservation Center here in Indiana. An artist's rendering of the concept of the restored building on the right, the atrium, glass atrium that separates the new from the old, and the new on the left, as you see it here, didn't give us what we felt we needed to judge the scale, the compatibility of the new addition to the old, the architectural elements that were supposed to be not mimicked, not repeated, but used as accents to the new building to make it read as a complement to the 1871 historic residence. So one of the best things in the early planning stages, I feel now, in retrospect, in looking back upon the whole project that we did, was to have a three-dimensional model made. A three-dimensional model that was able, and only able, particularly for those of us who haven't gone to the architectural school of planning, make sure that this massing of the new building did not overreach and dominate the massing of the old building. The charge to the architect for those designer students amongst you was to have this building complement the historic building. Reid 1991, not 1871 or an 1871 copy, stand on its own, but at the same time pick up elements of detail, overhang of the Italianate roof, elements of this triangular roof shape repeated here in the atrium and again in the adorners, pick up elements of that historic building, show them in the new building, but show them in a 1991 manner, not in an 1870s or 79 copy. Has this been done? I'll let you decide. We think it has. We think that also the honesty of the presentation of the old building holds true to form as well. We were unsure as to what the historic porch looked like. Being in the business for a long time, having architectural historians who graduated from this school and preservationists who graduated from this school, we could come darn close to speculating what the historic porch looked like. Oh, we didn't have any photographic evidence. We didn't have any drawing evidence. We didn't have any, obviously, on-site evidence. So instead of speculating with an 1871 Italianate porch, we used this porch area of the historic building to put our handicap ramp in to therefore amalgamate a much-needed design device, but at the same time depicting a porch-like area and having the modern roof texture and material and design and shape tie in with a glass of the atrium. Under construction, here is the old building from the canal. This is water, not the mirrored glass. Building now taking shape. The new building coming on as well. And here, from a little different perspective, but from the same side, from the canal side, you see downtown Indianapolis in the background with its skyline. And you can get, therefore, from this side, the treatment of, again, the overhang repeated here, not as an overhang, but as in a balcony railing. The Italianate cornice supports repeated here, not as cornice roof supports, but as a balcony railing. And in general, the shape of the building, obviously the color, the use of the materials being brick, repetitive, but we think not a copycat of the old building. A real challenge. Does it work? I'll leave it up to your design judgment to decide that for yourself. This building, the historic building, has two sides. You'll notice this side is much plainer than this side. The window lintels, for instance, with that lovely limestone overhang, and in the same way with the overhang in the new building, repeating this side of the historic building, whereas the more simple side of the historic building on the opposite has a more simple side of the new connection as well. A double-sided building, if you will, to modern-day architectural parlance, unusual, but we were not building a new building and connecting it to an old building. Remember, we were making an addition to a historic building. From the particular architectural features. We felt that the connecting glass atrium, obviously a functional necessity. We had to get back and forth from the old building to a new building. We're converting, remember, a 1871 residence to a 1991 office building, so there had to be functional connections between each. We had to have some place to put the elevator. We put it in the atrium. We had to have some place for people to go up and downstairs. That was placed in the atrium. And remember, as I said earlier, this is the oldest building on the Lower Central Canal in downtown Indianapolis. So the atrium serves then as a visual link to the canal. Can't see it very well in this slide, and I apologize for that. But if in any place in this atrium, either from the elevator or from the stairs or from the floor platforms, the canal is visible on the other side of this glass connector. Interior-wise, in the old building, we tried to keep to the original as much as possible. Here we have the original hallway with the newel in place, the original railings as well, front door in place, most of the woodwork, and with the interior treatments done as well. Many questions during the year do we get. How do I attach, how do I enlarge my historic building? What do I do? And we feel, at least, that our answer to that is with the Heritage Preservation Center of 340 West Michigan that you've just shown, that you've just been shown in downtown Indianapolis. Our program is a statewide program, and we try to fill all of the various activities at historic preservation calls. One of them, an important one, is the interpretation of life as it was. And with the Morris Butler House in 1865, Second Empire Museum of the Decorative Arts at 1204 North Park Street, we think we do this, both in the restoration and in the interior presentation. Just one piece, my favorite, the Wooten desk in the study. The Wooten desk was one of the most popular American furniture pieces of its time, designed and made by the Wooten Company in Indianapolis, Indiana, that had an international market for its wares. With the look at the look at the wonderful cubby holes, pigeon holes, little pull-out drawers. It abounds with nooks and crannies to put papers, and their motto was appropriate: a place for everything and everything in its place. In order to service the state by way of historic preservation, our strategy is to provide professional staff service, help and assistance in 5 field offices around Indiana. This is the Kemper House, built in 1873. In the 1876 exposition, this building and the prototypes of it was the Indiana Pavilion at the 76 exposition. There are 2 other existing prototypes of it, one in Vincennes and another in Crawfordsville. We operate out of here to serve the Indianapolis area by way of historic preservation needs, and particularly have been successful with the operation of a revolving fund in the city itself. Our field office for the southern part of the state is in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Here, the Grissamore House, a wonderful transitional, federal and classic style building of the early 1840s. We operate out of here to serve some 23 counties in the southern part of the state. We're now in the northern part of the state in South Bend, or this small cottage that was the butler's cottage, dating from about 1885 to a massive estate. Has 4 people working out of it, including a circuit rider operation whereby 2 of our staff people literally travel as the old circuit rider judges used to administer historic preservation commissions in the 20-some-odd counties in the northern part of the state. To serve the West, we're currently located in Greencastle, Indiana, on Courthouse Square there, sharing an operation called Main Street, Indiana, with probably the premier Main Street local program in the state. We were in this storefront building on the Courthouse Square. Now, gee whiz, I keep jumping ahead here, sorry. Now restored, and soon we hope to move from Greencastle to a larger operation, more strategically located in a larger marketplace. We hope to close the Greencastle office and open a Terre Haute office for the 17, 18 counties we serve in the West sometime in the earlier part of this year. Closer to Muncie in Cambridge City, our Eastern Regional Office has a little bit different mission, for it combines the curatorial and museum activities of operating a 1840s National Road tavern and farmstead with complete with outbuildings. My favorite happens to be the barn, although not an originally 1840s barn, but changed over the years so that it has more of an 1880s exterior appearance. But the interior is one of, I feel, our most successful renovations, adaptive reuses, if you will, of a historic building, where we've converted the barn's interior into a lecture and a small concert auditorium that seats very comfortably about 50, and with a combination of a wonderful blank wall space for exhibits that we have a sequential number operating and rotating at all times. It is from our Eastern Regional Office in Cambridge City that we endeavor to assist Muncie in its historic preservation matters. I thought I would turn a bit now to the local level, kind of pull in our focus, look narrowly, if we will, at one community. If I appear to be forming an overall judgment, it's my lack of preparation for this presentation that you're hearing. Because usually it's not all saved or none saved. Usually a community's history and historic preservation comes somewhere in between. And I think it's always helpful to look back and see what has happened in order to get charged up to deal with what the issues in preservation are now, and particularly to prepare for the future. Here is the old Delaware County Courthouse, built by the Tolan firm in 1885, 1887. Courthouse that, to me at least, has a majesty, has a dignity of government, has what I would call kind of the higher calling that we would hope our governmental leaders would house themselves and their decisions in. Here is the Delaware County Courthouse that we have today. The old one demolished in I believe late 60s, 1968, and this is in its stead. Not particularly unusual story for courthouse cities in Indiana, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, but we hope now that the tide has turned. And with a major credit to this school and to David Hermanson, your venerable professor of architectural history, who has done a complete that I know of study of courthouses, their architecture and their importance to each community, and then if the sum is if the whole is the sum of all its parts, then to the whole of Indiana as well. A personal aside, I am not from Indiana, but spent the first 20 years from 1 through 20 of my life in Connecticut. My only relatives on my mother's side were Seward and Gertrude Price of Muncie, Indiana. 711 Linden Avenue in Muncie, Indiana. And every year, religiously, we would get in our car, even during the war years when the rationing of gas was at a premium, and travel to Muncie for a visit. So my exposure to this community and particularly its architecture, I have rather a personal exposure and somewhat of a nostalgic one that goes back until before the Second World War. One of our programs is surveying every single county to determine where are the historic sites and structures throughout the state. We do this on a county basis. We did Delaware County in 1985, again with thanks from the Ball Brothers Foundation, who found and documented and then published, and your school has the published report, 1,713 sites and structures, of which 932 are in 9 historic districts. There are now in Delaware County 6 districts on the National Register and 19 buildings. That's about average for a county of this size, with this population in Indiana, for 1,713 sites, so that were surveyed some 6 years ago. Well, let's just look at some of them here locally for a minute. That wonderful stretch of cultural enrichment, both by way of architecture and cultural activity. Here, the E.B. Ball House, the E.B. Ball Center, that I used to call the Minnetrista Center, but I can't call it anymore, because you all changed the name, did you not? This is now the Minnetrista Culture Center, and what I showed previously is now the E.B. Ball Center, but formerly was the Minnetrista Center. I hope I got all that right. And what a wonderful panorama now of old and new coming together down one avenue in one relatively mid-sized city in mid-America. I hope you're all familiar with the George Ball House, also along this stretch, named Oakhurst. That is now being remodeled with particularly restored, I should say, apologies, with particular attention to the marvelous shingle stylization, the Crystal Baker House being in the Emily Kimbrough Historic District, one of those 9 historic districts that I mentioned earlier. This, the Emily Kimbrough House, one of the first projects of the local citizens group, then Historic Muncie, now the Historic Delaware Alliance. People getting together, deciding that something ought to be done about that Emily Kimbrough House. It should not be needlessly torn down or allowed to self-destruct, but be brought back as it is today, as an important part of the cultural history and evidence of this community. Unfortunately, we can't say that about every building. Union Station, built in two parts. The first one about the late 1880s in the left-hand part of the screen. The second in the 1890s in the right-hand part of the screen came down, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago. Too bad. The Masonic Temple, a huge structure, presenting in 1980s and 1990s enormous challenges for preservation. Built in 1926 and commemorated with a community auditorium by the Ball brothers for $150,000. The Ball brothers, as I hope many of you know, moving here from Buffalo after their factory burned there to take advantage of the natural resources of this area to further the production of their product. Now, with a very creative enactment of a historic preservation easement, helped out by Historic Landmarks, and taking the clue from another organization on Monument Circle in downtown Indianapolis, the Columbia Club, an easement formed on the building and all of the HVAC in the building, allowing for a $500,000 fundraising effort to now go on, whereby all of the money donated is tax deductible, whereby if the foundation were not created using this vehicle of a historic easement, such could not be the case. And what about the old federal building? Some of you might refer as the old post office, converted now in a major adaptive reuse into a convention center and home of the Chamber of Commerce. How important it is for preservationists and conservationists to involve the business community, to involve the development community. Here at the Chamber of Commerce, the symbol organization throughout America, in community after community of business, local business leadership, a part of the preservation and sustenance of this, and the sustaining, rather, of this building. I will not leave before a few words about the program here. This program that you all are participating in, either as a professor, administrator, or student, is one of the pioneer preservation programs in the Midwest, if not the country. This is the new building, now the old building. This is the new building in 1972 after the school moved into it. Before all of the additions are off to the right side of this building. And Scott Truex was absolutely right. It has been our pleasure as an organization and me as an individual to have participated in countless programs and projects throughout the years, including our town tour program in connection with your community project program on a local level that has been so popular and so widely used, in going into hometowns and going into local communities and showing what can happen with their efforts there. And the creativity of this school has let you find new ways to enjoy your historic buildings, even though some may not be up and in whole, but in pieces and in parts with, I call it Archie Park. Here, the only one in the state of Indiana, I think it's a cause for applause. The fact that the Roberts Hotel is again the Roberts Hotel, and is still open and still flourishes. Richmond can't say that about theirs, but Muncie can about theirs. Sure, there's been some downsides. I wouldn't present a balanced and complete picture if I didn't point out the loss of one of the most important retail centers in central Indiana, the loss of the Ball stores just a year and a half ago. Well, there's some issues coming up, aren't they? Or maybe there's an issue right now that I hope all of the preservationists in this audience, both professional and at it for a while, and those of you kind of learning the trade, Muncie City Hall, at least my agents tell me, has a big question about it. I'll return to Muncie in 8 minutes. But let's now travel around the state and look at what we consider the 10 most historic, but the 10 most endangered buildings in Indiana. And then we'll come back to Muncie. The historic Cannell and Cotton Mill. These are in alphabetical order, and I'm going to introduce you to the 10. The oldest cotton mill, the oldest mill maybe extant in Indiana, built in 1849 on the National Register of Historic Places, the most recent addition to the National Historic Landmark listing. That's really the top of the hit parade. This building owned by Historic Candleton Inc., like Historic Muncie Inc., formed for a single building purpose. Historic Muncie Inc., remember, became the Kimbrough House. Historic Candleton Inc. For the Candleton Mill. We're involved with them on a local basis. Candleton's on the Ohio River, not a very large community. Maybe you've heard of Candleton, maybe you haven't. Maybe you've heard of Tell City, its big brother neighbor. Maybe you haven't. Smaller the city is, the harder the job seems to be to do something about a structure of that enormity. Second endangered species, if you will, taking a page from our conservation friends, the Governor Alvin Hovey House in Mount Vernon, 1875 built, owned by the Masons. They want to take it down for a parking lot. We convinced the county commissioners, lo and behold, to use it as an office annex. County commissioners brought it. We think this one is saved. We think this one can be removed from our endangered list when we produce a new endangered properties list for 1992 during Historic Preservation Week. Third of the 10, Indiana Avenue in downtown Indianapolis, across the canal from the Heritage Preservation Center that I showed you earlier. Important for several reasons. You may not like what you see in front of you. It's not very pretty, but I'll have you know it's only 5 of the remaining buildings along Indiana Avenue that have any representation at all of our black, African-American commercial center of not only Indianapolis, but of central Indiana as well. Anchored on one end by the Walker Theater, named for Madam Walker, the first black female millionairess in the country, and on the other end by the 1871 Coon House that we saw earlier as the older portion of the Heritage Preservation Center complex. Indiana Oxygen Company, our 4th, owned by now the Eli Lilly Company, who say that they will do everything responsible that is feasible in order to preserve or adaptively reuse this building. A wonderful confection of industrial architecture and design of the 1920s. It's an oxygen company, mind you. Look at the canisters, the oxygen canisters. You can't see them very well with my shaky hand here. And also the canister holders. If I had a better slide, you would see that is an acetylene torch explosion in a Tiffany glass above the door. And the interior has come through since 1928 in mint condition. Fifth on the endangered list, a wonderful sweeping catwalk in Michigan City, on Lake Michigan, going out to a lighthouse that no longer needs to be tended by a human being, walking that catwalk out to service the lighthouse. The Coast Guard has now made the lighthouse function through a computer linkage, a hookup that I don't quite understand. And so this structure now, with its wonderful sweep out into the lake, becomes obsolete, non-usable, and therefore in jeopardy. We think we've got something worked out. We aren't sure. We can remove one of the buildings, the seventh building from the endangered list, the Proviance House in Huntington, Indiana. There are a lot of Proviances in Huntington over the course of the years. This is the David Alonzo Proviance House, a wonderful example of that kind of exuberant, what would you call it, French shadow-esque architecture. We don't have many of them in Indiana because of the advertisement and the publicity and the media interest in placing 10 most endangered buildings on a list like you present 10 most endangered species. The attention was garnered of a developer who has now bought the building and is converting it into a bed and breakfast. We're now in Vincennes, in the southwestern part of the state. This is the St. Francis Xavier Parochial School, built in 1884 to serve the parishioners of the historic old cathedral there. Those of you who have been to Vincennes know the wonderful and historic Catholic tradition in that community. The bishop thought that this building should be removed. After all, it was old, had some cracks in the walls, the plaster was peeling, and the bricks were dirty. He was going to build a new school, one story high, concrete block, brick facaded, absolutely no character, no dignity, no saving grace whatsoever. Through a lawsuit initiated by the locals, funded by us, with us providing legal counsel as well, and through a local ordinance, the demolition permission was turned aside, and we hope this can be the third building removed. The eighth, the Smith Covered Bridge in Rushville, one of a collection of 6 wonderful covered bridges in that community. Question has not been answered on this. The issue is still in question. The Valley House in Brookville, Indiana, built in 1852, is a part of the hotel population, if you will, of that river and canal community, vacant for a long time, buildings that aren't used, don't have heat, don't have electricity, don't have people in them, deteriorate quickly. This is the jeopardy that we find this structure in today. And lastly, the West Baden Springs Hotel, built in West Baden Springs next to French Lick in Orange County near Paoli, Indiana. Built in 1902, the largest domed structure in North America when it was built. Maintained that superlative until the 1960s when the Astrodome was built in Houston. Now the building is owned after a bankruptcy litigation by a receiver who is unfortunately located in Los Angeles, California. Look at the wonderful interior space of that domed building. Model airplane shows in the 40s were held in here just to show. I'm talking about flying model airplanes. To give you an idea of the spaciousness, the roominess. More recently, Larry Bird has had basketball camps in here as well. Larry Bird being a famous resident of nearby French Lick. The building is, because vacant, is not in good shape. The collapse to the outer wall and roof occurred during last spring's rains. We have formed, in order to save this building, now in the a national historic landmark, a coalition of statewide leaders. There's some 25 statewide leaders on this coalition, everybody from the governor to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Indiana. And of the 25, maybe 3 of us are full-time preservationists to get encouragement for what emotions and what a draw a building of substance and historic import can have. A week from today, we're holding a press conference in this building announcing that we've raised $140,000 to repair the exterior of that building, to keep it standing until the building can be marketed through, we hope, the marketing efforts of this coalition. Well, if we're going to remove 3, we think we're going to remove 2, what other 3 or what other 2 should we put on? Our first choice is agricultural hall at the Purdue University. Purdue, known as the home of agricultural science in this dominantly agricultural state, was built in 1902 by Robert Frost Daggett, a noted architect, in a classically collegiate style. Purdue is seeking to have this building removed and a new food science building put in its place. Our second candidate is the Wabash High School in Wabash, Indiana. Wade and excuse me, forgot Wade's partner's name. One of you architectural historians help me out. Wing and Mehurin building of 1894 with, and maybe, just maybe, Muncie City Hall would be a candidate next year for the most endangered. I would hope not. I would hope that with your continuing resources here, that this building by certainly spring would no longer be even in the to be considered endangered category. Well, we do as well as you all think we do. And I say that in the most populist manner and with the most democratic intention. We are here only because we think that preservation is local. Like Lyndon Johnson said, that all politics is local, preservation is local. This country's historic architecture will not be saved from Washington. This state's historic architecture will not be saved from Indianapolis. Muncie's architecture will be saved on a local basis, Peru's on a local basis, Michigan City's, and Indianapolis's on a local basis. We are available for help and with the combined efforts, we hope with my concluding slide to keep Hoosier heritage alive. Thank you. Any questions? That's right. Good.
Are there any questions?
Yes, sir. Yeah, the question was, do you have any rural or landscape initiatives on the way? I can talk to rural pretty thoroughly. Landscape, not so, unfortunately. There's a Rural Preservation Council that is dealing, we think, at least the initial stages, with our rural context. not just the farmstead as an individual building, but the farmstead, the outbuildings, and then the surrounding cultural landscape. Maybe we do deal with landscapes. What's a cultural landscape? It's been explained to me as the man-made context or setting in which those historic buildings in the rural setting in Indiana sit. Some nominations to the National Register and to the State Register in that regard. And we also have some recognition programs coming up as well. We've accepted 3 easements, 3 scenic easements on 3 rural properties. That includes the farm buildings, the farmstead, the outbuildings, and in one case about 250 acres around the rural setting. We see through our field offices or through an alert citizen like yourself something that can be done, we will move on it in that regard. If you're talking about formal landscape, kind of urban as opposed to rural-urban landscape protection, we haven't done much on that. And it's not out of a lack of interest. We just haven't done much on it. Yes, sir.
Tax laws have an effect on preservation. Some of the federal tax laws taken a few years back.
Yeah.
The way that it's explained it.
Yeah.
Go into the effect.
Talking about the tax laws having an effect on historic preservation, probably the 76 and 80 Rehabilitation Tax Act did much more for America, $4 billion worth of our national historic properties were rehabilitated, and they've taken away the major part of those incentives. Jim Ridenour used to be the head of the DNR here, is now head of the National Park Service. We've been working with him and some of our other legislative people in Washington. He just sent a memorandum, to his credit, to the director of OMB asking for the reinstatement of these tax incentives that have been taken away. There still is rehabilitation tax laws on the books, Francis, but they've been so diminished through the 1986 Tax Reform Act that they're virtually not used anymore. Behind you, Francis. I don't think it matters. I don't think that's a relevant question. I think if you're a true preservationist and it's a historic property, then you better start thinking of ways to control it. It's not up to us to figure out who's going to do it or what's going to be done with, in my view. Or maybe you all maybe disagree with that. But if our business is historic preservation and that's a historic property and that historic property is deteriorating, then we better move to try to do something about it. What? If it's historic, it's our problem anyway. If some guy owns it, doesn't care about it, is letting it deteriorate, it's still our problem. Because it's historic, and that's the business we're in, is preservation of historic buildings. You follow me? So let's us get control of the building, and then let's try to find a person or a user. A very valid question, a very good, valid, academic classroom question. It really is. But it's not up to us to worry about what are you going to do with that building. So many buildings now are being used for not what they were built for anyway, you know? I mean, and I'm not trying to give you a smart answer, but I do feel deeply about that. I think those of us that are preservationists who worry about how to use a building are wasting energy. We ought to be thinking about how to control that building or get the non-sympathetic owner away and get a sympathetic owner in there. And then the use will take care of itself. Usually the user comes first. The user brings with him or her a use. The use doesn't come first. Usually. But it's a damn good question. And one asked frequently. Yeah, way in the back. I can't hear a thing you're saying. Yes. Does landmarks work have municipal governments set up preservation plans, particularly historic preservation commissions or historic district commissions, very much so. We think that ought to be just absolute public policy, as the conservation of trees and open spaces ought to be public policy, ought to be public policy in a local level to preserve local landmarks. Yes, sir. Good question. One of the movements now are called heritage corridors. And probably our largest is the Wabash Heritage Corridor, which if you know anything about Indiana, you know the Wabash River starts up in Fort Wayne and ends up down through Vincennes and down on the Ohio River in the southwestern part of the state. I mean, it really traverses the whole state. And 2 years ago, the legislature enacted a Heritage Corridor Commission that was going to try to take the parts of our heritage, both natural and man-made, and pay attention to them through that corridor. There's a corridor in the southern part of the state, runs from Evansville over to Aurora, called the Southern Heritage Corridor. And you all up here were working on a corridor. Tom Sargent's here tonight. Were you not, Tom, from here up the line and talking with some of your cultural leaders here? There's a corridor idea from Muncie up to Fort Wayne, I believe, as well. So the regionalism, the looking out further, if that's what you're getting at, than just the community, you know, or just the county, I think is terribly important. And the buzzword now in our game are these heritage corridors that either are linked by a river, or in the southern part of the state by a road, or I guess here by a road and a river. That's a very current question. I think that's it, Scott.